garage still smelled like him. That's the first thing I noticed when I finally worked up the nerve to go in there. 2 years after the funeral, motor oil and cedar and something else I could never name. Just him, the way a person has a smell that you don't notice for 30 years of marriage, and then suddenly it's the only thing you can think about. I'd been avoiding the garage since we buried my wife, Eleanor. Her tools were still hanging on the pegboard in the order she'd arranged them. She was more organized than I ever was. 34 years together, and she never let me forget it either. She'd say it with that half smile, the one that meant she was teasing but also completely serious. I'm 66 years old. I spent 22 years as a structural engineer before I retired, and I'd like to think I've handled most of what life threw at me with a reasonable amount of composure. The diagnosis, the treatments, watching her get smaller in that hospital bed, I held it together. I'm not sure I did it well, but I held it together. Going through her things was different. That undid me in ways I wasn't prepared for. I'd been putting it off for 2 years, which my son told me was not healthy, Dad. He said it the way he says most things, with a tone that suggested he'd already consulted someone about it and arrived at a conclusion before the conversation started. My son's name is Connor. He's 38, lives 40 minutes away in the same suburb where Eleanor and I raised him, and he works in commercial real estate. His wife is Brianna. They've been married 11 years. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because even now, even after everything, I don't enjoy saying bad things about my own son. He's my blood. I changed his diapers. I coached his Little League team 2 seasons in a row even though I knew nothing about baseball and had to read a book about it. I love Connor. That doesn't stop being true just because of what happened. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The reason I finally went into the garage that Saturday morning in October wasn't courage. It was the leak. We'd had 3 days of rain, and the water was coming in somewhere along the back wall, pooling near the shelving unit where Eleanor kept her gardening supplies. I needed to move things, assess the damage, call someone. Practical necessity got me through the door when sentiment couldn't. I worked my way along the shelves, moving clay pots and seed packets and a bag of fertilizer that had partially hardened. Her work gloves were hanging from a hook, stiff with dried soil. I stood there holding them for a minute longer than I should have. That's when I saw the coffee can. It was on the highest shelf, pushed back behind a row of small terracotta pots. A Folgers can, the big red one, the kind you don't really see anymore now that everyone buys coffee in bags. Eleanor had a thing about repurposing containers. There were probably 6 or 7 of those cans throughout the house holding screws, rubber bands, spare keys. I almost didn't think twice about it. But this one had a piece of blue painter's tape on the lid with my name on it. For Robert, open when you're ready. Her handwriting. That looping, slightly backward slant she'd had since she was a girl. I stood on the step stool and took the can down and sat on the floor of the garage with it in my lap for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a USB drive, a small notebook, one of those pocket Moschines she liked, and a sealed envelope with instructions written on the outside. Read the notebook first, then the drive, then open the envelope. I read the notebook sitting right there on the garage floor, with the door open and the October air coming in cold around my ankles. Eleanor had written it over several months, she said at the beginning, starting about 6 weeks before she died. She'd been hiding it from me on purpose, not because she wanted to keep secrets, but because she knew that if she told me what she'd been documenting, I'd have confronted Connor immediately, and she was afraid of what that would do to me, to us, before she was gone. She wrote, "I need you to know this, but I need to be the one to tell you on my own terms when I can't be hurt by it anymore. Forgive me for the timing. I knew you'd be okay. I knew you'd handle it the right way. I just needed to protect a little longer." Eleanor was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 14 months before she died. The first 8 months were treatment, surgery, chemo, the whole grinding machinery of it. The last 6 months were something else. We knew where it was going. We made arrangements. We said what needed to be said. What I didn't know was that during those last 6 months, while I was focused on her care, on keeping the house running, on pretending to both of us that I was holding up fine, Connor and Brianna had been having a different set of conversations. Eleanor had become suspicious gradually, small things. Connor asking, very casually, whether Eleanor had spoken with the estate attorney lately. Brianna mentioning more than once how complicated it must be to manage a property like ours. The house, the cabin up in the Poconos that Eleanor's parents had left her, the investment accounts. Connor offering to help with paperwork in a way that felt less like a son helping and more like someone positioning himself. Then Eleanor found the email. Connor had left his laptop open on the kitchen table one afternoon when he came to visit, and she'd seen it, not snooping, just glancing, an email to Brianna. It discussed the Pocono cabin specifically. It talked about the current real estate market in Monroe County, comparable properties, what a quick sale might net if we move before the end of the year. The email used the phrase, "when mom's gone twice." She was sitting 12 feet away from her son when she read it. Eleanor didn't say anything that day. She closed the laptop and made tea and sat with Connor for another hour, talking about nothing. About the neighbor's new dog, about a movie she'd seen on television. Then he left and she went into the bedroom and cried for a long time, and then she stopped crying and she started writing things down. Over the following weeks, she documented everything she could. Dates and times of conversations. The way Connor had begun steering questions toward the cabin whenever he visited. Had she updated the deed? Was it in the trust? Did I know where the original paperwork was? She noted when Brianna stopped coming to visits altogether. She documented a phone call she'd overheard me having with Connor, where he'd asked me, very reasonably, very casually, whether I'd thought about what I'd do with the cabin after she was gone. Before she was gone, while she was in the next room. She also, and this is the part that stopped my breath, noted that she'd called our estate attorney on her own. His name is Mr. Forsyth, same man who drew up our will 17 years ago. She'd met with him privately without telling me, and she'd made changes to the documentation around the cabin. She wrote, "I'm not leaving him anything to take from you. Whatever decisions you make later are yours. But I'm closing the door," he was standing in front of. I sat on that garage floor until my back started to ache and the cold had worked its way through my jeans. Then I went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The USB drive contained recordings. Eleanor had used her phone to record 3 conversations. Connor visiting on a Tuesday afternoon in March, about 9 months before she died. Connor and Brianna together in April. And a final one, Connor alone again in June, 5 weeks before the end. I won't go through all of it. I'll say that what I heard was not the voice of a son concerned for his mother. I heard a man who had decided with remarkable certainty that the cabin in the Poconos was already his, that it was just a matter of paperwork and timing. I heard Brianna's voice listing the cabin's square footage and the fact that a neighbor's property had sold in 90 days and wondering whether an estate sale or a private listing was cleaner. I heard my son use the phrase, "he'll be realistic about it" when referring to me, as though I were a problem to be managed. My hands were steady. I noticed that. I'd expected them to shake. I listened to all 3 recordings and then I sat there for a while, and then I poured the coffee out because it had gone cold and made a fresh cup. Outside, a blue jay was working at the feeder Eleanor had insisted I rehang every fall, and I watched it for a while, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Then I opened the envelope. Eleanor had written one last letter, longer than the notebook entries, the kind of letter she would have given me in person if she'd been able to, direct and specific and without any softness that wasn't earned. She told me what she'd changed with Mr. Forsyth. She told me the cabin was now in a separate trust, independently managed, with specific terms that required my approval for any sale or transfer during my lifetime, and restricted the distribution to Connor until 10 years after my death, subject to conditions. She told me she'd been worried I would feel betrayed by her doing this without me. She wrote, "You always wanted to believe the best of him. So did I. I just stopped being able to." She also told me something she told almost no one else, something she hadn't told me while she was alive, because she thought it would break something between me and Connor that she wasn't sure could be repaired, that the year before her diagnosis, when Connor had come to us asking for a loan to cover a shortfall in one of his real estate deals, and we'd given him $42,000, and he'd told us 6 months later that the deal had recovered and he'd be paying us back in installments, She had checked. She'd asked him directly for the documentation. He'd stalled, then deflected, then told her she was being paranoid and hurtful. She never saw a single payment. The $42,000 was gone, not a deal recovery, just gone. She ended the letter this way. I know you'll want to handle this quietly, and I know you'll want to leave a door open if he ever becomes the man I raised him to be. I'm not asking you to cut him out of your life. I'm only asking you not to give him the chance to do to you in grief what he was already doing to me while I was dying. You deserve better. You always did. I'll be listening for the wind in those Pocono pines. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat at that kitchen table for the better part of an hour. Connor called that evening, which he does every Sunday. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. How was I doing? How was the weather? Had I seen the game? Were the Eagles going to figure out their offensive line situation? Normal conversation. I answered everything he asked, and I asked him questions back, and I was calm because Eleanor had taught me something over 34 years about the difference between reacting and responding, and I was not ready to respond yet. On Monday morning, I called Mr. Forsyth. He was unsurprised to hear from me, which told me that Eleanor had warned him I'd call. He walked me through everything she'd done. The cabin trust was airtight. He also told me something I hadn't known. Eleanor had, on that same visit, quietly amended the primary will to remove a provision that would have given Connor access to a joint investment account in the event of my incapacity. That provision had been added years ago as a practical matter because someone had to be able to manage finances if I couldn't. She'd replaced Connor's name with that of my younger sister, Paulette, who lives in Asheville and has exactly zero interest in anyone's real estate. Eleanor had been thorough. I asked Mr. Forsyth to review everything, the whole estate plan. We met twice over the following 2 weeks. I made additional changes of my own. Connor's share of the primary estate was reduced to a fixed dollar amount, enough to make clear the intention was deliberate and not an oversight. The rest goes to a charitable trust with designated beneficiaries, including Eleanor's college scholarship fund at her alma mater, the hospice program that cared for her in the final weeks, and a land conservation nonprofit that protects the watershed in the Poconos near the cabin. The cabin itself I'm keeping. I went up there in November for the first time since Eleanor died. Just me and the woodpile and the sound of the creek at the bottom of the ridge. I fixed the gutter she'd been asking me to fix for 2 summers. I found her hiking boots still by the back door and left them there. I'll be up there again in the spring. I did tell Connor about the $42,000. Not over the phone. I drove to his house on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, and I rang the doorbell and I asked him to sit down at his own kitchen table, and I told him I knew. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call him names. I told him what Eleanor had found, and when he began with the explanation, the deal, the market, the intention to repay, I told him I had the records, that I had spoken with the attorney, and that I wasn't there to argue. I told him I loved him. I told him that was never going to change. I told him that Eleanor had loved him too, which was the reason she documented everything carefully instead of confronting him while she was dying, because she hadn't wanted her last months with him to be that. I told him that what he had done was a betrayal of both of us, at a moment when we were most vulnerable and least able to protect ourselves, and that I wanted him to sit with that. He cried. Brianna left the room. Connor said he was sorry. More than once. And I believe that he was. Or at least that he was sorry I'd found out. Which is not quite the same thing, and I'm 66 years old and I know the difference. I told him the estate arrangements had changed. I didn't give him every detail. That wasn't the point of the visit. I told him the cabin would not be sold during my lifetime, and that the distribution from my estate would be different than he may have expected, and that if he wanted to build something back between us, the door was open, but that it would be on different terms than before. He asked if there was anything he could do. I said I didn't know yet. I drove home on the interstate as the sun went down and the fields went orange and flat on either side, and I felt something that I couldn't quite name at first. Not satisfaction exactly. Not peace. Something quieter than both of those. Something like having finally set a box down that you'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. I still go to the garage sometimes and just stand there. I put her gloves back on the hook. I fixed the leak along the back wall. turned out to be a gap in the flashing, straightforward once I found it. I left the coffee can on the shelf, empty now, lid back on. My sister Paulette came to visit in December, and she and I ate takeout at the kitchen table and watched an old movie. And she asked me how I was really doing. The way only a few people in your life will ask that question, and actually wait for an honest answer. I told her about the garage, about the can, about Eleanor's letter. Paulette sat quietly for a long time after I finished, and then she said, "She always was the smartest person in any room." I said, "Every room we were ever in." I think about Eleanor every day, which is not a burden the way people seem to expect it to be. Grief changes shape. It doesn't go away. It becomes something you carry differently, and what it carries in it changes over time. Less of the raw shock of absence and more of the particular weight of a person's specific and irreplaceable self. 2 years ago, I didn't know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I still don't, fully. But I know I'm keeping the cabin. I know I'll be up there in April when the creek runs fast with the snow melt and the pines smell the way they only smell in the spring. I'll fix whatever needs fixing and sit on the porch with coffee and watch the light come through the trees. Eleanor said she'd be listening for the wind in those pines. I'm going to give her something to hear. I keep thinking about that coffee can. Something about the image stays with me. A plain red Folgers can, pushed to the back of a shelf behind clay pots, holding the most important thing anyone has ever given me. Eleanor could have left a dramatic letter on the kitchen counter. She could have told the attorney to call me the day she passed. She could have confronted Connor herself, made a scene, burned the whole thing down in her final weeks. She didn't do any of that. She waited. She documented. She thought it through with the same steady care she brought to everything in her life. And then she put it somewhere she knew I'd eventually find it, when I was ready, on my own terms. That's the part that undoes me even now, not the betrayal, the patience. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to do what Eleanor did, to know something that painful and carry it quietly, not out of weakness, but out of a deliberate choice to protect the people she loved, including the son who was betraying her. There's a kind of character in that which I don't think I fully recognized while she was alive. I saw it as stubbornness sometimes, or as her being private. Now I understand it differently. She wasn't hiding from hard things. She was deciding, carefully, which hard things were hers to carry and which ones she needed to hand off. She handed this one off at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. What Connor did came from a failure of that same quality. The willingness to sit with difficulty honestly instead of working around it. He didn't ask us directly for what he needed. He didn't come to me after the first real estate deal went sideways and say, "Look, I made a mistake. I'm in trouble. I need help." He maneuvered. He positioned. He had conversations about the cabin while his mother was in the next room, using phrases like "when she's gone" as though she were already a logistical problem rather than a person. That's not a failure of love, exactly. I still believe Connor loves me, in whatever way he's capable of. It's a failure of honesty. And when you lose your honesty, you lose your ability to build anything real, because everything you construct is sitting on a foundation that you know is false, even if no one else does yet. I'm not standing in judgment of him. I made my own mistakes over 66 years, and I'll make more. What I want for Connor, what I'd give almost anything for, is for him to find the kind of clarity that comes from choosing the harder, more honest path, even when the easier one is right there. That clarity is something you build over time. By doing small things right when no one's watching, by telling the truth when the lie would cost you nothing, by respecting the people in your life as full human beings rather than variables in your own plans. For me, this whole thing, the can, the notebooks, the recordings, the drive out to Connor's house on that Tuesday afternoon, it was a kind of test I didn't ask to take. And I think what got me through it was something Eleanor spent 34 years quietly building into me. The belief that how you respond to the worst things is exactly as important as what the worst things are, maybe more. I'm keeping the cabin. I'll be up there in April. I think she knew I would be.